So welcome to the video for today here at the Strength Culture, where we're going to be discussing a little bit more of a global human movement understanding on what it means to have a mobile or a stable joint and what influences the understanding of that in terms of human movement for the squat and the bench press in relation to the glenohumeral joint, so the shoulder joint. Today is going to be the first video in a little series that we do here on the Strength Culture YouTube channel relating to the shoulders and shoulder health through powerlifting, how you might better be able to interfere with some exercise interventions or some assessments to help guide you or put you in the direction that you need to help just control your total stress through the shoulders through powerlifting. But today's video, we're going to be discussing how the glenohumeral joint moves through both the squat and the bench, and how some of these global understandings of what makes a joint mobile or stable and how it relates to these two movements. So before we get into the shoulder, first we need to understand that pretty much every joint, in fact every single joint, sits on a continuum of mobility and stability. And I think it's pretty inherent that most people understand this by now, that mobility and stability only really relate to each other. And in order to have a very mobile joint, it means that we have to reduce the stability of the joint. And vice versa, if you have a very stable joint, it means that the joint must be restricted in its mobility. So that would be the continuum here. And there's three main things that affect a joint's inherent mobility or stability. And that is active restraints, passive restraints, and osseous restraints. Before we go into active and passive, let's just knock osseous out of the park. So osseous restraints will be the formation of the bones themselves for the joint. When we look at a knee joint, we have a great big tibial plateau, and then we have the femoral condyles that sit, or condyles that sit on the tibial plateau. And as a result of how the bones are structured, it pretty much limits us to only one range of motion, which is flexion extension. So only one kinematic range of motion, being we can move through flexion extension, and we're limited in frontal plane and we're limited in transverse plane. Of course, the ligaments affect that as well, but for the most part, the bony formation of the joint limits us to purely just sagittal plane movement. When we look at the glenohumeral joint, we don't really have much osseous restriction. We have a very small glenoid fossa that only takes up about 1/3 of the humeral head, and as a result we get very large ranges of motion in all directions, and this is inherent by just how the bones are structured. So that would be how osseous restrictions affect the stability of a joint. Then we come into active and passive restraints, and this is where we start to get a little bit more direct in what is occurring through a bench press or a squat when it relates to the glenohumeral joint. Passive restraints are just that, they're passive. They don't have any sort of activation pattern from the central nervous system, or we can't really control them. So a passive restraint of the glenohumeral joint would be the labrum, and how it sort of wraps off the glenoid fossa and it wraps around the humeral head and holds it tight to the glenoid. And then also some of the ligaments that cross the glenoid fossa into the humeral head, and how they can offer some stability through some of the arthrokinematics that might be occurring through human movement. So some of those gliding, rocking and rolling movements that are occurring inside the joint, and those ligaments supporting and going taut in certain directions to stabilize the joint and not just let the ball fly out of the socket. So that would be your passive restraints of the glenohumeral joint, the labrum and the ligaments. We also have a couple other ones like the nervous system, so some of the nerves that cross could actually offer stability as well, but pretty much negligent. Then we come into active restraints, and this is pretty much your muscles and tendons, and this is what we have control over as a human, moving our human body through certain patterns and movements. So the active restraints that offer stability through the glenohumeral joint would be all the muscles that cross and all the tendons that cross the glenohumeral joint. So some of the big players would be like your anterior deltoid, your posterior, and your medial deltoid. You also have your pec major coming across the anterior side. On the through the shoulder blade, we have the cuff, obviously the four muscles that sort of wrap around the humeral head and suck it nice and tight onto the glenoid. So on the posterior side, the lat that runs underneath and sort of wraps around into the the anterior portion of the humerus. So we have all of these big muscle groups that interplay together to offer stability in all different ranges of motion. And the one we're going to talk about today is the bicep tendon. So the long head of the bicep tendon obviously runs up the humerus and then runs anterior and superior through the labrum and into the actual joint itself and attaches on the inside of the joint. And what this bicep tendon does is it offers stability for the humeral head when it gets driven anterior or superior. So when the humeral head drives forward or up, that bicep tendon can offer a little bit of stability for that humeral head pushing forward. And this is what we want. This is the crux of what we're talking about today. When we talk about the osteokinematics of human movement for the bench press and the low bar squat, we're talking about two global movements of extension of the glenohumeral joint and external rotation of the glenohumeral joint. Extension occurring in both the squat and the bench press, and external rotation really occurring in the low bar squat. And what both of these movements does in terms of arthrokinematics, so the sliding, gliding, rocking and rolling of the glenohumeral joint or the humeral head on the glenoid fossa, is it drives the humeral head forward and up out of the socket. And over time, if that's not accounted for with some correct sort of tendon loading or just global good human movement, if that goes sort of unfixed or unaccounted for, we can actually get a little bit of damage occurring to the bicep tendon. And that's where we start to get that sort of very direct pain at the front of the shoulder. A lot of people complain about it in low bar squats, and a lot of people complain about it in the bench press because of that exact reason. When we move through both of those positions over time, under load, consistently week after week after week, we can actually start to drive that humeral head into that bicep tendon over and over and over again. And that's where we start to get some of these sore shoulder feelings that can affect subsequent sessions, particularly if you're doing back-to-back days of squatting and benching, which a lot of people do complain about. They talk about the inability to back up a heavy squat session with a bench session because of how their shoulders feel. And this is one of the major key reasons why it's occurring. And that is because the glenohumeral joint is unstable by nature, which is a great thing. It allows us all this mobility, but as a result, the active restraints are what we rely on to stabilize the joint when the joint gets out of its typical ranges of motion. And powerlifting can promote that if we don't have adequate mobility through the joints or adequate positioning of the shoulder blade, because let's be honest, if the shoulder blades are in the wrong position, the glenohumeral joint will then be in the wrong position as well. So this is just the first video on a series that we're going to be doing here on the Melbourne Strength Culture YouTube channel, where we're talking about shoulder health through powerlifting. Next week, we're going to go and dive into some of the assessment processes that we use here at Melbourne Strength Culture and how that could help identify the strategy that you need to employ to improve your shoulder health through your powerlifting journey. So as always, if you have any comments, drop them in the comment section below. Any questions or queries down there as well. All of our links are in the description box. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you can follow along this series of shoulder health through powerlifting. As always, happy lifting and welcome to the culture.